the coaches, for the players, for the support staff. And I thought Mark's comment about being in line, your culture is in line with all of the way to the top. The owners, the general manager, everybody, the support staff, from top to bottom, we're all in behaving in a manner that emphasizes what we believe in. We want to be in a safe environment. We want to be in an environment where we trust each other. Everybody needs to feel like they belong.
There is something happening inside the Indiana Fever organization that goes far beyond a losing streak, a coaching controversy, or a locker room disagreement. What is unfolding right now in Indianapolis is something that people who followed this league closely have never quite seen before. And the reason it matters so much, the reason it has captured the attention of millions of people who had never watched a single WNBA game before 2 years ago, is because at the center of all of it is the most commercially transformative player the women's game has ever produced. This is not hyperbole. This is not fan exaggeration. This is a documented, receipts-backed, numbers-verified reality. And right now, the organization that was handed that player, handed that moment, handed that once-in-a-generation opportunity, appears to be doing everything in its power to destroy it. Someone who was actually inside that arena recently sat down and described what they experienced. Not what the cameras showed, not what the broadcast highlighted, what it actually felt like to be in that building. And they compared it directly to what they had experienced at a Caitlin Clark event in Iowa. What they described should send shockwaves through every executive office, every sponsor boardroom, and every broadcast partner that has tied its commercial future to this franchise. Because what they felt inside that Indiana Fever arena was not the energy of a franchise on the rise. It was not the electricity of a building filled with people who had driven hours, flown across state lines, and waited years to see something special. What they felt was something far more sobering. And by the time this is over, you are going to understand exactly why that matters, exactly what it means for the future of this team, and exactly who is responsible for the situation we are now watching unfold in real time. Let's start with the eyewitness account, because it is the most direct and most specific piece of evidence available about what is actually happening on the ground in Indianapolis right now. The person who attended this game had a reference point. That is what makes their testimony so significant. They were not walking into an Indiana Fever game for the first time with no baseline for comparison. They had previously attended the jersey retirement ceremony for Caitlin Clark at Carver Arena in Iowa. They had been inside a building that was filled wall to wall with people who were there for one reason and one reason only. They had felt what a Caitlin Clark crowd feels like when it is operating at full intensity. They knew what that energy was. They had a physical memory of it. And then they walked into that Indiana Fever arena. And the word they used to describe the difference between those two experiences was night and day. 2 words, simple, direct, and absolutely devastating in their implications. Because when someone who has stood inside Carver Arena during a Caitlin Clark celebration walks into what should be one of the marquee environments in the WNBA and uses the phrase night and day to capture the contrast, they are not talking about a slight dip in enthusiasm. They are not describing a crowd that was a little quieter than expected. They are describing a fundamentally different experience, a fundamentally different crowd, a fundamentally different atmosphere. And that difference is not just about feeling. It is about money. It is about the commercial architecture that makes this entire operation worth what it is currently worth. Here is why crowd composition matters in ways that go far beyond vibes. The Indiana Fever before Caitlin Clark arrived was a franchise playing in front of roughly 4,000 people per game on average. That was the baseline. Those were the numbers. That was the established fan base, the loyal core, the people who had been showing up for years before anyone outside of hardcore WNBA circles knew the team existed. That audience was always going to be there. They were not going anywhere. But they were also not the reason that ticket prices went through the roof. They were not the reason that national broadcast partners started scheduling Indiana Fever games in prime slots on CBS and Prime Video. The transformation, the commercial revolution that turned this franchise into something genuinely worth talking about, came entirely from the people who were not there before Clark arrived. And what the eyewitness saw inside that arena was an audience that looked, felt, and sounded like the pre-Clark Indiana Fever, not the post-Clark Indiana Fever, the pre-Clark Indiana Fever. Which means something extremely important and extremely alarming is already happening. The new audience, the audience that made this franchise commercially relevant on a national scale, is already beginning to disappear. Not in projections, not in theoretical models, in actual observable reality, in the actual composition of the people sitting in those seats. Right now, while Caitlin Clark is still on the team, still suiting up, giving everything she has for an organization that increasingly appears not to deserve it. Now let's talk about Lin Dunn, because everything that is happening inside this franchise traces back to decisions and statements coming from the president of basketball operations. And recently, Lynn Dunn gave an interview that, if you were paying close attention, told you everything you need to know about where this organization's head is at. She spoke about culture. She spoke about the need to remove the weeds. She used the language of cultivation and alignment and core values and behavior. And if you listened to that interview with fresh ears and no context, you might have thought she was describing a struggling franchise trying to find its identity after a difficult stretch of results. But if you've been watching the situation closely, if you have tracked every move this organization has made since the moment Caitlin Clark was drafted, then you know exactly what she was talking about. And more importantly, you know exactly who she was talking about.
Lin Dunn did not become the president of basketball operations of the Indiana Fever yesterday. She has deep roots in Indianapolis. She has a long history in this city. She and head coach Stephanie White are not just colleagues, they are the establishment. They are the people who built Indiana basketball into what it was before the Clark era, and they are the people who are now, apparently, trying to build it back into what it was before Clark arrived. They are the institution. They are the hierarchy. And in a city like Indianapolis, when you are the institution, when you are the hierarchy, when you have spent decades building relationships and loyalties and a certain way of doing things, you have something very specific to protect. And protecting it becomes the priority, even when protecting it means ignoring the most transformative opportunity you have ever been handed. The removing weeds language is not accidental. It is not a throwaway metaphor chosen carelessly in the heat of an interview. When the president of basketball operations of a franchise that was playing in the middle of one of the most significant cultural moments in women's sports history starts talking publicly about elements of the roster that do not fit the agenda, she is sending a message, and the message is clear. The message is that whoever is disrupting the established order, whoever is bringing in an audience that doesn't feel like the traditional Indiana audience, whoever is demanding a standard of accountability that the organization is not accustomed to meeting, that person is the weed. That person is the problem. That person is the one who needs to be managed, cultivated, or removed. Let that sit for a moment. The president of basketball operations of a franchise that was playing in front of 4,000 people is publicly using weed removal metaphors while managing the single most commercially valuable player in the history of women's basketball. That is the situation. That is where we are. And it tells you something very specific and very troubling about the culture Lin Dunn is so desperate to protect. The word that has been thrown around most aggressively this week to describe Caitlin Clark is uncoachable. Uncoachable. Think about what that word means when it is applied to a player of Clark's caliber, and consider who benefits from that characterization being out in the world. If Caitlin Clark is uncoachable, then the coaching staff's failures become her fault. If she is a problem player, an outburst machine, a locker room disruption, then the organizational chaos surrounding this franchise stops being about organizational decisions and starts being about one difficult personality that management has had to heroically navigate. The narrative is constructed, the framing is deliberate, and the timing, the fact that this characterization is emerging with force and volume right now in this specific window, is not coincidental. What makes this particular narrative worth examining carefully is not just the content, but the pattern. One person calling a player difficult is gossip. Two people saying similar things within the same week is a coincidence worth noting. Multiple voices connected to the same organizational establishment, pushing the same themes, using similar language across a compressed time frame, is something that reasonable observers are entitled to examine as a coordinated effort. Not a conspiracy theory, not fan paranoia, a pattern. And the pattern here is one that several credible voices who track this league have identified and described publicly. The characterization of Clark as uncoachable, as prone to outbursts, as someone who needs to be managed rather than supported, is emerging from voices that have documented connections to the Indiana basketball establishment, and it is emerging at precisely the moment that that establishment is under the most significant public scrutiny it has ever faced. Here is what the organizational record actually shows. Lin Dunn stood by while an expansion team, the Portland Fire, scored their first 100-point game in franchise history against her team. She watched while her head coach rotated 11 players in a single quarter in what observers described as looking less like a professional basketball strategy and more like a middle school tryout. She presided over a situation in which her general manager, Amber Cox, went on a documented blocking spree on social media, cutting off fans who were voicing legitimate frustration about the product on the floor. These are not rumors. These are not speculation. These are observable events that were witnessed, recorded, and discussed publicly. And after all of it, the framing coming out of the Indiana front office is that the issue is the weeds on the roster. That reframing is breathtaking in its audacity. It requires you to look at organizational dysfunction of a very specific and measurable kind and conclude that the source of the problem is the player who is filling seats, driving viewership, generating merchandise revenue, and producing highlight plays that are being watched by millions of people who had never heard of the Indiana Fever before she arrived. It requires a level of institutional denial that goes beyond poor management. It starts to look like something deliberate.
Lin Dunn has spoken about the culture she wants to build and protect with great passion and great frequency. So let us examine that culture on its actual merits rather than its stated aspirations. This is a culture that reportedly convened a 2-hour meeting specifically to address Caitlin Clark. 2 hours for a player who by every available metric is the most important commercial asset this franchise has ever had. Not a 2-hour meeting to address the team's defensive struggles, not a 2-hour session to work through the coaching staff's rotation philosophy, a 2-hour meeting about Caitlin Clark. Think about what that signals about organizational priorities and about where the friction inside this franchise is genuinely originating. This is also a culture where the head coach was captured on camera telling the face of the franchise in a moment that was seen by an enormous number of people to get out of her face. Not in a private film session, not in a closed locker room moment, on camera, in a way that was visible to the public and to the media. The head coach of a franchise that owes a significant portion of its current commercial value to the player she was speaking to, telling that player to get out of her face. And the organizational response to that moment was not accountability. It was not a public acknowledgement that the interaction was inappropriate. It was silence, followed eventually by more narrative about Clark's behavior and attitude. This is a culture that revoked the press credentials of Scott Agnes, the reporter who had the integrity to give the fan base accurate information about injury situations and organizational decisions that the franchise would have preferred to keep quiet. When an organization revokes a reporter's credentials for telling the truth, it is not protecting its culture, it is protecting its secrets. There is a difference between a culture of accountability and a culture of secrecy that uses the language of accountability as cover.
What the Indiana Fever has demonstrated through its actions this season is the latter. And the general manager's social media conduct deserves its own examination. Amber Cox did not accidentally block a handful of frustrated fans. What was documented was a pattern of blocking that targeted voices who were critical of organizational decisions. Fans who pay for tickets, buy merchandise, and contribute to the revenue stream that funds the operation were being systematically cut off from organizational communication channels because they were asking hard questions and expressing legitimate frustration. That is not a front office operating with confidence in its decisions. That is a front office that cannot withstand scrutiny and has chosen to eliminate the scrutinizers rather than address the scrutiny. If this is the Indiana culture that Lin Dunn is so committed to protecting, then the culture itself is the problem. A culture of secrecy, a culture of deflection, a culture that holds 2-hour meetings about its best player instead of building systems to support her, is not a winning culture. It is a culture designed to preserve the comfort and authority of the people at the top, regardless to the cost to the organization's competitive and commercial health. The most alarming development of the past week is not a game result, it's not a sideline incident, it's not even another chapter in the coaching controversy. The most alarming development is that the word trade has entered this conversation in a way that can no longer be dismissed as fan speculation or media noise. Credible voices with genuine market access have begun raising the possibility that the Indiana Fever are at minimum not ruling out the idea of moving Caitlin Clark. And when Lin Dunn was directly asked about it, her response was not a flat denial. It was not the emphatic, unambiguous rejection you would expect from an organization that understands what it has. What she offered instead was language about looking at what fits the agenda, language about evaluating what aligns with the culture, language that to anyone paying close attention sounds far more like a door being left open than a door being slammed shut. Toronto has been mentioned. Other destinations have been floated. And while none of this has moved into the territory of confirmed reporting, the fact that it's being discussed at all, the fact that credible observers are treating it as a genuine organizational possibility rather than a social media fantasy, tells you something important about where this situation has deteriorated to. We are talking about an organization that is actively contemplating whether the player who transformed their commercial fortunes, who brought a national audience to a franchise that had been commercially invisible for years, fits their agenda. Not whether their agenda fits her, whether she fits theirs. The historical parallel that applies here is one that anyone who has followed professional sports at the highest level immediately recognizes. There is a reason that organizations that have generational talents do not spend their energy trying to fit those talents into existing systems. The lesson that sport after sport has taught, painfully and repeatedly, is that you do not manage a generational player. You do not cultivate them into your preferred structure. You do not hold 2-hour meetings about their attitude and then contemplate trading them because they don't conform to your culture. You build the world around them. You restructure the organization to maximize what they can do. You hire coaches whose systems are designed to make them better, not to make them comply. You build around the generational talent because the generational talent is the foundation, not one component among many to be evaluated against an agenda.
Lin Dunn is not building around Caitlin Clark. She is building around Stephanie White and Amber Cox and a front office culture that predates Clark's arrival and appears determined to survive it. She is constructing a bunker, surrounding herself with loyalty and yes people, and blocking out every signal that the world outside that bunker is sending about what this franchise actually needs to do to justify the commercial moment it has been handed. And if that bunker mentality results in a trade, if the Indiana Fever actually moved the player who is responsible for everything commercially significant that has happened to this franchise in the past 2 years, it will not be a basketball decision. It will be an institutional confession. It will be an admission, written in the language of roster moves and trade confirmations, that Lin Dunn was not capable of handling the magnitude of what she was given. The Clark fanbase is not a passive audience that will absorb whatever the Indiana Fever organization delivers and keep buying tickets and jerseys regardless. What has happened over the course of this season is that a fan community that came to this franchise with enormous enthusiasm and commercial energy has received a series of signals from the organization that its presence is not entirely welcome. And fan communities respond to signals. They are not irrational. They observe organizational behavior, draw conclusions about whether their engagement is valued, and adjust their participation accordingly. The organized resistance that has emerged from the Clark fan community, the formal efforts to reduce ticket purchases for specific games, the coordinated staying home movements, the social media accountability campaigns, these are not random expressions of frustration. They are rational responses from a community that perceives itself as being disrespected by the franchise whose product they came to support. And the evidence from inside the arena at this recent game suggests that those responses are producing measurable results. The eyewitness who attended this game and compared it to the Iowa experience did not just describe a quieter crowd, they described a crowd that felt like the pre-Clark Indiana Fever, which means the Clark audience, the new audience, the audience that makes this franchise worth what it is currently worth, was not there in the numbers that a marquee Clark event should generate. And when you pair that atmospheric observation with the viewership data, the 1.3 million viewers for a nationally televised game on CBS, when the documented Clark viewership poll should have been generating 1.6 to 1.7 million, the picture becomes very clear. The commercial disengagement is not coming. It is already here. It is already measurable. It is already affecting the numbers that determine the franchise's value to its broadcast partners and sponsors. What makes this particularly concerning from an organizational standpoint is the timing. This disengagement is happening while Clark is still on the team. The audience is not waiting to see whether she gets traded or leaves in free agency or decides she has had enough of the situation in Indianapolis. A portion of that audience is already pulling back right now in response to what they are observing about how the organization treats her and treats them. If that is the audience behavior while Clark is present and active, the commercial projections for what happens after she is gone become significantly more troubling for any organizational calculation that assumes the value captured during the Clark era will sustain itself into a post-Clark future. The pre-Clark fanbase will still be there, 4,000 per game, give or take, the loyal core who were showing up before Clark arrived and will continue showing up after she leaves, but the courtside seats will not be $17,000. The national television windows will not be there. The sponsorship premiums will not be there. The merchandise volumes will not be there. The broadcast rights improvements that were negotiated on the strength of Clark's audience will not generate the renewal terms that a league office and franchise ownership are currently anticipating. The math is not complicated, and yet somehow the people at the top of this organization appear to be operating as though the math does not apply to them. There is a specific kind of organizational failure that is particularly difficult to watch from the outside because it is so clearly preventable and so obviously self-inflicted. It is not the failure of an organization that tried everything and came up short. It is not the failure of an organization that was outmaneuvered by superior competition or hit by circumstances beyond its control. It is the failure of an organization that was handed everything it needed to succeed at the highest level and then systematically dismantled that advantage through institutional arrogance, personal loyalty over organizational health, and a profound inability to recognize the size of the moment it was operating in. The Indiana Fever was a franchise that existed in relative commercial obscurity for years. Dedicated fan base, committed organizational staff, real history in the city of Indianapolis, but not a franchise that was generating national conversations or drawing audiences from across the country, or producing the kind of commercial energy that changes the financial architecture of a league.
And then Caitlin Clark arrived, and everything changed. The ticket demand changed, the viewership numbers changed, the merchandise demand changed, the broadcast interest changed. The entire commercial reality of this franchise changed in ways that were historically unprecedented for a women's sports organization. And the response from the organizational leadership, from the people who had been running this franchise before Clark arrived, appears to have been something other than gratitude, adaptation, and a wholehearted commitment to building the best possible environment for the player who had delivered this transformation. The response appears to have been something closer to resistance. Resistance to the new audience's expectations. Resistance to the accountability that comes with national visibility. Resistance to the idea that the way things had always been done in Indianapolis might need to change to accommodate the reality of what this franchise had now become. Lin Dunn wanted her quiet arena back. She wanted her 4,000 loyal fans who never questioned the circle motion offense or asked why the rotation was making no sense or demanded transparency about injury situations. She wanted the comfortable, established order in which she and Stephanie White were the unquestioned authorities, and nobody outside Indianapolis was paying close enough attention to hold them accountable for results. And instead, she got a national spotlight, a global audience, a franchise transformation, and a fan base that was not going to sit quietly and watch organizational dysfunction without saying something about it. That was uncomfortable. That was unfamiliar. And rather than rising to meet that discomfort and use it as the motivation to build something genuinely great, the organizational response was to treat the discomfort as the enemy. The coaches, the front office, the established Indianapolis basketball community circled the wagons. The narrative about Clark's attitude and behavior began to take shape. The language of culture and weeds and alignment entered the public discourse, and the commercial moment that could have defined this franchise for a generation started slipping away. Not because of anything Clark did, but because the people responsible for building the environment around her decided that protecting their own authority was more important than protecting the asset that was funding all of it. When you step back from the specific details, the individual incidents, the particular statements and social media blocks and revoked credentials and 2-hour meetings, and look at the full shape of what is happening here, what you see is an organization at war with itself. Not in the way that competitive sports organizations are always managing internal tensions and competing interests, in a deeper and more damaging way. The Indiana Fever in its current configuration contains two fundamentally incompatible realities. There is the commercial reality of what this franchise has become since Caitlin Clark arrived, a nationally relevant, heavily watched, high-demand entertainment product with a passionate and vocal fan community that has commercial expectations commensurate with what they have invested in this franchise. And there is the institutional reality of what the Indiana Fever was before Clark arrived, and what its organizational leadership appears to want it to return to being: a modestly attended, locally focused, establishment-run operation, where the people at the top make decisions without being questioned, and the fans who show up are grateful for whatever they get. Those two realities cannot coexist indefinitely. One of them is going to determine the direction of this franchise going forward. And right now, based on every observable signal coming out of Indianapolis, the institutional reality is winning. The people who were in charge before Clark arrived are still in charge. Their culture is still the official culture. Their agenda is still the official agenda. And the commercial transformation that Clark brought with her is being treated less like an asset to be cultivated and more like a disruption to be managed. The clock is running on this situation in a very specific and very measurable way. Every week that the organizational dysfunction continues without resolution is a week in which more Clark audience members make the decision to disengage. Every nationally televised game that draws 1.3 million instead of 1.7 million is a data point that broadcast partners are collecting and will reference in future rights negotiations.
Every incident that reinforces the perception that the Clark fan community is not welcome inside the Indiana Fever's organizational culture is a fan who stops buying tickets, stops purchasing merchandise, stops generating the commercial activity that makes this franchise worth what it currently appears to be worth on paper. The trajectory is not ambiguous. The direction is not unclear. An organization that is alienating its most commercially significant audience while managing its most commercially significant player into a situation that appears increasingly untenable is not going to wake up one morning and discover that the problem has resolved itself. These situations do not resolve themselves. They accelerate. They compound. And the moment that a trade becomes official, the moment that Caitlin Clark appears in another franchise's uniform, the acceleration will become something that no organizational statement, no cultural initiative, no coaching adjustment will be able to address. Lin Dunn was given something rare, genuinely rare, the kind of once-in-a-career opportunity that most sports executives spend their entire professional lives hoping to encounter and never do. A generational player, an audience that materialized from virtually nothing, a commercial transformation that required no blueprint because it was happening in real time, generating its own momentum, writing its own story. All that was required was the organizational wisdom to recognize what had arrived, the humility to adapt to it, and the competence to build structures that would allow it to flourish. What has been demonstrated instead through every observable action this organization has taken since the friction between the established Indiana culture and the Clark era began to surface publicly is that Lin Dunn and the organizational leadership around her do not appear to possess those qualities in sufficient measure for this moment. They appear to possess instead a very human, very understandable, and very costly set of qualities: attachment to the way things have always been done, loyalty to the people who were there before the transformation, and a resistance to the idea that the transformation requires them to fundamentally change how they operate. The fans see it. The numbers show it. The eyewitness standing inside that arena, remembering what it felt like to be at Carver Arena for the jersey ceremony, feeling the absence of that energy in a building that should have been electric, confirmed it in the most direct possible terms. The Indiana Fever does not feel like a Caitlin Clark franchise right now. It feels like the Indiana Fever before Caitlin Clark. And that feeling, that atmospheric reality that no spreadsheet can fully capture, but any human being present in that building can immediately sense, is the most important single data point in this entire story. Because what that feeling tells you is not just about today's game or this week's controversy, or the specific incidents that have generated the specific news cycle. What it tells you is about direction, about trajectory, about what this franchise is becoming versus what it had the opportunity to be. The audience that made this franchise matter is watching. They are making decisions every single day about whether to stay engaged, whether to buy tickets, whether to tune in, whether to invest their time and money and emotional energy in a product that increasingly does not appear to value what they bring to it. And right now, based on everything that has been seen and heard and felt, those decisions are trending in one direction, not toward deeper engagement, not toward renewed enthusiasm, toward the quiet, devastating, commercially catastrophic conclusion that the Indiana Fever had their moment, squandered it through institutional arrogance and organizational dysfunction, and no longer deserve the audience that Caitlin Clark built for them. Lin Dunn, the world is watching. The numbers are being tracked. The atmosphere inside your building has been felt by people who know what it is supposed to feel like. And what they are feeling right now does not feel like a franchise that is rising to meet its moment. It feels like a franchise that has already decided, in the most consequential and irreversible way possible, that protecting yesterday is more important than building tomorrow. The clock is not just running. For some part of this audience, it has already stopped.